as every detail helps and could lead to finding Lily and Jack.
I'm going to keep fighting for the rest of my life to find these kids. That's the only goal I have at this point.
Everyone stop moving, Stevens ordered, his voice taking on the controlled urgency of someone who realizes they may have found what they've been searching for, but not in the way they'd hoped. Walsh, get on the radio and request immediate backup. We need forensics teams, the coroner, and Detective Morrison out here as soon as possible. The team secured the area, marking the perimeter with tape and ensuring that no evidence would be disturbed while they waited for additional personnel. But even as they followed proper procedure, even as they maintained professional discipline, they all understood what they had likely found. After a month of searching, after hundreds of volunteers had covered thousands of miles of terrain, after families had held on to hope against increasingly impossible odds, this remote clearing in the dense forest was probably where their search was going to end. It took nearly 3 hours for the full investigative team to reach the location, hiking in with portable equipment and setting up a processing station in the wilderness. Detective Sarah Morrison arrived with a forensics crew and took one look at the disturbed area before ordering everyone except essential personnel to maintain distance while they began their careful examination of the site. What they found confirmed everyone's worst fears. Hidden beneath a layer of leaves and forest debris, in a shallow depression that had been carefully concealed, were the remains of Jack and Lily Sullivan. The children had been found together, positioned in a way that suggested they had been placed there with deliberate care, rather than simply discarded. Even in death, even after weeks in the wilderness, they remained side by side. The discovery was processed with the methodical precision that major crime scenes require, but every person involved understood that they were dealing with more than just evidence. These were the bodies of 2 children who had been loved, searched for, prayed over by an entire community. The site was treated with the reverence due not just to victims of crime, but to the broken dreams of everyone who had hoped for a different outcome. Detective Morrison stepped away from the scene to make the most difficult phone call of her career. At 3:47 p.m. on October 15th, she dialed the number that would connect her to Jack and Lillian's parents, knowing that the words she was about to speak would destroy what remained of their world. "Mr. Sullivan," she said when he answered, her voice carefully controlled despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "This is Detective Morrison. I need you and your wife to come down to the station. We've found Jack and Lillian." The silence that followed lasted only seconds, but it contained the weight of a father's worst fear being confirmed. "Are they?" he began, unable to finish the question. "Sir, I think it would be best if we talked in person. Can you and Mrs. Sullivan come in immediately?" But he already knew. Parents always know, some primal instinct that recognizes the tone of voice that carries the worst possible news. "They're gone," he said, the words barely a whisper. "My babies are gone." Within the hour, the Sullivan parents were sitting in a small conference room at the Rcmp station, surrounded by detectives, victim services coordinators, and clergy who had been called to provide support. Detective Morrison sat across from them, her hands folded on the table, her face grave with the weight of the news she had to deliver. "We found Jack and Lillian this afternoon in a remote area of forest," she said, her voice gentle but clear. "I'm very sorry to have to tell you that they were deceased when we found them. This is now being investigated as a double homicide." Mrs. Sullivan's reaction was immediate and devastating. The sound that came from her wasn't quite a scream, and wasn't quite a sob, but something more primal, the sound of a mother whose children have been torn from her life. Her husband reached for her, but his own grief made him unable to provide comfort, and they collapsed into each other, 2 people whose world had just ended completely. The victim services coordinator, a woman experienced in delivering tragic news to families, moved to provide immediate support while Detective Morrison continued with the information she was required to share. "We will be conducting a thorough investigation to determine exactly what happened and who is responsible. I want you to know that every available resource will be dedicated to finding answers and seeking justice for Jack and Lillian." But the parents were beyond hearing procedural information. They were lost in the first moments of a grief so profound that it seemed impossible to survive. Their children, the center of their universe, the source of their joy and purpose, were gone forever. Not missing, not lost, not waiting somewhere to be rescued.
Gone.
Outside the Rcmp station, news crews had already begun to gather. Word of the discovery had leaked, as it always does in major cases, and by evening the parking lot was filled with television trucks and reporters preparing to broadcast the news that everyone had hoped never to hear. The press conference was scheduled for 6 p.m., giving the family time to notify relatives and close friends before the news became public. Detective Morrison would face the cameras and officially announce what the community had been dreading. The search for Jack and Lily Sullivan was over, but not in the way anyone had prayed for. The investigation was just beginning, but the hope that had sustained hundreds of searchers, thousands of volunteers, and an entire community for over a month was ending. Jack and Lily Sullivan had been found, but they would never again laugh in their backyard, never again run into their parents' arms, never again fill their home with the sound of children being children. The monster who had taken them from their family, from their future, from their very lives, was still out there, still free, still breathing the air that Jack and Lillian would never taste again. And now, instead of a search and rescue operation, the community was facing something much darker: the hunt for a killer who had destroyed innocence itself. If you're feeling the weight of this tragedy, if you're thinking about your own children or the children in your life, then you understand why this case became so important to so many people. Drop a comment and let me know, how do we protect our children when evil can look just like everyone else? Because what investigators were about to discover about this case would prove that the most dangerous monsters are often the ones hiding in plain sight. The forest crime scene was unlike anything the investigating team had encountered before. As forensic specialists worked methodically through the evidence, a disturbing picture began to emerge of what had happened to Jack and Lily Sullivan in their final hours. The location itself told a story. This wasn't a random dump site chosen in panic, but a carefully selected location that suggested planning, familiarity with the terrain, and a chilling level of premeditation. The site was accessible only by a hiking trail that required local knowledge to navigate, located far enough from any road or residence to ensure privacy, but positioned in a way that suggested the perpetrator knew exactly where they were going. Dr. Patricia Hayes, the forensic pathologist called in to examine the scene, noted several details that would prove crucial to understanding the crime. The positioning of the bodies indicates care was taken in their placement, she explained to Detective Morrison as they worked in the dim forest light. This wasn't someone who was trying to dispose of evidence quickly. The children were laid side by side, covered with natural materials in a way that suggests the perpetrator wanted them to be found eventually, but not immediately. The preliminary examination revealed that both children had died from asphyxiation, likely within hours of their disappearance from the backyard. There were no signs of sexual assault, which ruled out some of the most common motives in child abduction cases but raised different, equally disturbing questions about why someone would kill two innocent children. More troubling were the physical evidence details that suggested the children had been kept alive for some time before their deaths. Their clothing showed signs of having been changed. Their hair had been brushed and arranged. Their hands had been cleaned. Someone had cared for them, maintained them, treated them almost like possessions rather than victims. This level of care combined with the ultimate outcome suggests we're dealing with someone with a very specific psychological profile, explained Dr. Michael Torres, a forensic psychologist brought in to assist with the investigation. The perpetrator wanted to keep these children in a controlled environment, possibly to fulfill some fantasy or compulsion, but ultimately always intended to kill them. The crime scene processing took 2 full days, with forensic teams working in shifts to ensure that every piece of potential evidence was documented and collected. Soil samples were taken for analysis, hoping to find trace elements that might indicate where the children had been held before being brought to this location. Fiber evidence was collected from their clothing and the surrounding vegetation. Even insects were gathered, as forensic entomology could help establish a more precise timeline for when the bodies had been placed at the site. But it was the discovery of several small personal items that provided the most heartbreaking insights into Jack and Lillian's final days. Jack's favorite dinosaur toy was found carefully placed next to his body, but forensic analysis showed that it had been cleaned recently, suggesting that whoever held the children had been aware of the toy's importance to the boy and had made efforts to maintain it. Similarly, a small notebook was found with Lillian, containing drawings that she had apparently made while in captivity. The drawings showed stick figures of children in what appeared to be an enclosed space, with bars drawn across windows and doors. In childish handwriting, she had written, "I want to go home," and "Where is Mommy?" These artifacts provided devastating evidence that Jack and Lillian had been alive and aware during at least part of their captivity, that they had known they were separated from their parents, and that 6-year-old Lillian had been mature enough to understand that something was terribly wrong with their situation. The location analysis revealed additional disturbing details. The site was positioned in a way that it could be accessed from multiple directions, suggesting the perpetrator had scouted it carefully and established escape routes. More troubling was the discovery of what appeared to be a makeshift camp about half a mile away, with evidence of recent habitation including food containers, bedding materials, and children's items that didn't belong to Jack and Lillian. This suggests we might be dealing with someone who has done this before, Detective Morrison explained to her team during their evening briefing. The level of preparation, the knowledge of the terrain, the psychological control demonstrated over the victims, all of this indicates experience with abduction and possibly murder. The investigation expanded immediately to examine unsolved missing persons cases throughout the region and beyond. Database searches were conducted to identify any similar crimes with comparable characteristics: children abducted from safe environments, held for extended periods, then killed without sexual assault. The pattern was unusual enough that it might provide a signature to identify other crimes by the same perpetrator. Within days, connections began to emerge. 3 other cases in neighboring provinces over the past 5 years shared similar characteristics: young children who had disappeared from their homes or safe environments, been missing for weeks before their bodies were found in remote locations, killed by asphyxiation without evidence of sexual assault. In each case, the children had been found with their personal belongings arranged carefully around them, and in each case, evidence suggested they had been kept alive for some time before being killed. The realization that Jack and Lillian might have been victims of a serial killer sent shockwaves through the investigation team and the community. This wasn't an isolated tragedy, but potentially part of a pattern of crimes that had been occurring across the region for years without being connected. "We're dealing with someone who has been perfecting this process," explained FBI behavioral analyst Dr. Sarah Chin, who was called in to assist with the profile development. The care taken with the victims, the remote locations chosen for disposal, the absence of sexual motivation, all of this suggests someone who is fulfilling a very specific psychological need through these crimes. The profile that emerged was disturbing in its implications. The perpetrator was likely someone with extensive knowledge of wilderness areas, possibly someone whose work or hobbies brought them into contact with remote forest locations. They demonstrated organizational skills and the ability to plan complex operations over extended time periods. Most troubling, they appeared to view children as collectible objects rather than human beings, caring for them temporarily before ultimately disposing of them. Local knowledge was clearly a factor, as each crime had occurred in areas that would require familiarity with local terrain and access routes. This suggested someone who lived or worked in the communities where the crimes occurred, someone who could blend in and gather information about potential victims without arousing suspicion. The investigation began to focus on individuals who had connections to multiple crime locations, who possessed the skills and knowledge necessary to carry out such complex operations, and who had potential psychological motivations for committing these specific types of crimes. Background checks were expanded to include anyone who had lived or worked in areas where similar crimes had occurred. Cross-referencing databases revealed several individuals who had been present in multiple locations during relevant time frames, but each lead required extensive investigation to either eliminate or confirm as viable suspects. The forensic evidence from Jack and Lillian's bodies provided additional clues. Hair fibers that didn't belong to either child suggested contact with someone who had dark hair and possibly worked in an environment where specific types of industrial fibers were present. DNA evidence was found under Lillian's fingernails, indicating that she had fought her attacker at some point, providing what might be the crucial evidence needed to identify the perpetrator once a suspect was located. But perhaps the most chilling discovery was a small digital camera found hidden near the crime scene. The camera contained photographs of Jack and Lillian taken during their captivity, images that documented their fear and confusion but also revealed details about where they had been held. The background in the photographs showed what appeared to be a basement or underground space with concrete walls and minimal lighting. These photographs provided the breakthrough investigators had been seeking. The images could be analyzed for any identifying details about the location where the children had been held. More importantly, they confirmed that the perpetrator had been documenting the crime, possibly for future reference or satisfaction, which suggested a level of organization and psychological pathology that might help narrow the search for suspects. The investigation had evolved from a local missing persons case to a multi-jurisdictional manhunt for a serial killer who had been operating undetected for years. Jack and Lillian Sullivan hadn't just been victims of a random act of violence. They had been chosen by someone who made a practice of stealing children's lives. Leave a comment right now and tell me, does this change how you think about this case? Because what investigators were discovering about Jack and Lillian's killer was more terrifying than anyone had imagined. This wasn't just about two missing children. This was about a monster who had been hiding in plain sight for years, perfecting the art of making children disappear. The revelation that Jack and Lillian Sullivan were likely victims of a serial killer transformed the investigation from a local tragedy into a national manhunt. The Rcmp established a joint task force combining resources from multiple provinces, federal agencies, and specialized units trained in hunting the most dangerous predators society produces. The scope of the investigation expanded exponentially as detectives realized they weren't just seeking justice for two children, but potentially for multiple victims across several years and jurisdictions. The behavioral profile developed by FBI analyst Dr. Sarah Chin painted a chilling picture of the perpetrator they were hunting. This individual demonstrates extremely sophisticated planning and organizational skills, she explained during a task force briefing. They're able to identify vulnerable targets, conduct surveillance without detection, execute complex abductions, maintain control over victims for extended periods, and dispose of evidence in ways that delay discovery. This level of competence suggests extensive experience and possibly professional training in areas like security, law enforcement, or military operations. The geographic analysis of the connected cases revealed a disturbing pattern. The crimes formed a rough circle across 3 provinces, with each incident occurring in communities that were connected by major highway systems. The perpetrator appeared to be mobile, possibly traveling for work, and demonstrated intimate knowledge of wilderness areas in each location where crimes had occurred. Detective Morrison found herself coordinating with investigators from across the country as they worked to identify connections between cases that had previously been handled as isolated incidents. The Amber Lake case from 2 years prior involved 7-year-old twins who had disappeared from their school playground during recess. The Riverside incident had claimed 5-year-old Michael Torres, who vanished from his grandmother's backyard during a family barbecue. Each case shared the same disturbing characteristics: careful planning, extended captivity, ultimate murder without sexual assault, and bodies found in remote locations with personal belongings arranged ceremonially around them. The most promising lead emerged from the digital camera found near Jack and Lillian's bodies. Forensic analysis of the photographs revealed several potentially identifying details about the location where the children had been held. The concrete walls visible in the background showed specific construction patterns and materials that might help identify the type of building. More importantly, reflection analysis of the camera lens had captured partial images of the photographer, showing portions of clothing and what appeared to be work boots with distinctive tread patterns. Computer enhancement of these reflection images provided investigators with their first potential physical evidence of the perpetrator: a partial view of someone wearing dark clothing and work boots, with what appeared to be a tool belt or utility equipment visible at their waist. The image quality was too poor for facial identification, but it suggested someone who worked in construction, maintenance, or a similar field that required specialized equipment. This physical evidence was cross-referenced with employment records from all the communities where related crimes had occurred. The investigation focused on individuals who had worked in multiple locations, particularly those employed in jobs that would provide knowledge of wilderness areas and access to underground or secluded locations suitable for holding captives. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A retired construction worker named Robert McLeod, reading about the case in local news coverage, contacted investigators with information about a former coworker whose behavior had always troubled him. There was something off about Danny, McLeod explained during his interview with Detective Morrison. He knew too much about kids in every town we worked in, always talking about which families had children, what their schedules were, where they liked to play. At the time, I thought he was just being friendly, but looking back, it feels creepy as hell. Daniel Harrison was a 43-year-old utility maintenance worker who had been employed by various companies throughout the region over the past decade. His work involved maintaining electrical and communication systems in remote areas, which required extensive knowledge of wilderness access routes and underground infrastructure. More significantly, employment records showed that Harrison had worked in or near every community where the connected child murders had occurred, often within months of each incident. Background investigation revealed a disturbing pattern in Harrison's personal history. He had no criminal record for violent crimes, but had been fired from several jobs for inappropriate interest in children and had been the subject of complaints from neighbors about watching local families too closely. He lived alone in a series of rented properties, always choosing locations that were isolated and offered privacy for activities that neighbors might not see. Property records revealed that Harrison had recently been renting a small house on the outskirts of town, situated on several acres of wooded land with an old root cellar that matched the description of the location seen in the photographs found with Jack and Lillian's bodies. When surveillance teams arrived to observe the property, they found evidence of recent activity, but discovered that Harrison had abandoned the location sometime after the children's bodies had been found. The search of Harrison's abandoned property provided the evidence investigators needed to confirm their suspicions. The root cellar beneath the house matched exactly the location seen in the captivity photographs. Forensic analysis revealed DNA evidence from multiple victims, including Jack and Lily Sullivan. Personal items from other missing children were found carefully stored in containers, like trophies or mementos from his crimes. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery of detailed journals documenting Harrison's activities over several years. The journals revealed a meticulous record of surveillance conducted on dozens of families, with particular attention paid to households with young children. He had documented school schedules, family routines, security measures, and optimal times for potential abductions. The journals showed that Harrison had been watching the Sullivan family for months before taking Jack and Lillian, learning their patterns and waiting for the perfect opportunity. The manhunt for Daniel Harrison became a coordinated effort involving law enforcement agencies across multiple provinces. His photograph was distributed to every police department, border security station, and airport in the country. Media coverage intensified as the public learned they had been searching for a serial killer who had been living among them, working normal jobs, appearing to be just another member of their communities. But Harrison had vanished as completely as his victims had. He had apparently been planning his escape route for some time, as investigators discovered he had been gradually liquidating assets, closing accounts, and eliminating traces of his presence in the community. His last known location was a gas station 3 provinces away, where security cameras had captured him purchasing supplies that suggested he was preparing for extended time in wilderness areas. The investigation revealed the chilling efficiency of Harrison's operations. He had maintained multiple identities, used false documentation to obtain employment, and established caches of supplies in remote locations that could support him during extended periods of hiding. He had been planning for the possibility of discovery and had prepared escape routes that demonstrated the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized his crimes. FBI behavioral analysts warned that Harrison's flight pattern suggested he might attempt to continue his crimes in new locations where he wasn't known to authorities. Alerts were sent to law enforcement agencies across North America, warning them to watch for child abductions that matched his specific methodology. Parents were advised to be extra vigilant about their children's safety and to report any suspicious activity immediately. The search expanded to include wilderness areas where Harrison might be hiding, using tracking dogs, helicopter surveillance, and ground teams familiar with survival tracking techniques. His knowledge of remote terrain gave him significant advantages in evading capture, but it also limited his options to areas where investigators could focus their efforts. The psychological profile suggested that Harrison's need to control and kill children was compulsive, meaning he would likely attempt to continue his crimes even while being hunted. This made him extremely dangerous, but also potentially predictable, as his behavioral patterns might eventually lead to mistakes that could result in his capture. Tips poured in from across the country as his photograph was broadcast on every news station and shared across social media platforms. Sightings were reported from coast to coast, but each lead required investigation, and most proved to be false alarms. The public was on edge, knowing that a man who made a practice of killing children was somewhere among them, possibly already selecting his next victims. The investigation also revealed the scope of Harrison's planning extended beyond individual crimes. Evidence found at his property suggested he had been researching additional families in communities he hadn't yet targeted, indicating that Jack and Lily Sullivan were part of a much larger plan that would have claimed many more victims if he hadn't been discovered. The journals contained references to what Harrison called his collection, describing the children he had killed in terms that suggested he viewed them as objects to be acquired rather than human beings with lives and families. The clinical detachment with which he recorded details about their final days demonstrated a level of psychological pathology that made him one of the most dangerous predators investigators had ever encountered. As the manhunt continued with no success, investigators began preparing for the possibility that Harrison might never be captured alive. His knowledge of wilderness survival, combined with his obvious planning for this eventuality, suggested he might be able to evade authorities for months or even years. The task force expanded their efforts to include long-term surveillance of locations where he might eventually surface, monitoring of any remaining financial assets, and coordination with international law enforcement agencies in case he attempted to flee the country. But the most important work was continuing to identify additional victims and provide closure to families who might not even know their missing children had been murdered by Daniel Harrison. The investigation had revealed that Jack and Lily Sullivan were part of a series of crimes spanning multiple years and jurisdictions, and there might be other victims whose cases hadn't yet been connected to the pattern. The hunt for Daniel Harrison had become more than just an investigation. It was a race against time to prevent him from claiming additional victims while living as a fugitive. Every day he remained free was another day that some families' children were at risk from a predator who had perfected the art of making innocents disappear. Subscribe to this channel right now if you want to know what happens next in this manhunt, because the story of Daniel Harrison and his victims like Jack and Lily Sullivan is far from over. This monster is still out there, still dangerous, still planning his next move. And the investigators hunting him know that time is running out to stop him before he strikes again. The news that Jack and Lily Sullivan had been murdered by a serial killer who was still at large sent shockwaves through their community that reverberated far beyond the initial tragedy. Parents who had already been shaken by the children's disappearance now faced the terrifying reality that the person responsible for their deaths was not only still free, but had been living among them, working normal jobs, appearing to be just another member of their community, while secretly hunting their children. The psychological impact on the families who had searched for Jack and Lillian was devastating. Maria Gonzalez, the mother who had driven 8 hours to join the search efforts, found herself unable to sleep after learning the truth about what had happened to the children she had hoped to help rescue. "I keep thinking about those beautiful faces on the missing posters," she explained to a counselor. "I imagine finding them safe, scared but alive, running back to their parents. I never imagined that while we were searching, they were already gone, already taken by someone who had been planning to kill them all along." The elementary school where Lillian had been a student brought in additional counselors to help children process not only the loss of their classmate, but the terrifying knowledge that a bad person had been watching families in their community, choosing victims, planning crimes against children just like them. Teachers struggled to find age-appropriate ways to explain concepts that no child should have to understand. That sometimes adults who look normal can be dangerous, that bad things can happen even when parents are trying to protect their children, that the world contains evil that doesn't make sense or follow the rules that children are taught. 6-year-old Emma Martinez, one of Lillian's closest friends, asked her mother a question that summarized the existential terror that had gripped the community. "Mommy, if the bad man who took Lillian looked like a regular person, how do we know who is safe?" It was a question that had no satisfactory answer, and that highlighted the particular horror of crimes committed by predators who appear normal, who integrate themselves into communities, who use their ordinary appearance to gain access to victims. The volunteers who had spent weeks searching for Jack and Lillian experienced their own form of trauma as they processed the reality of what they had been looking for. Patricia Williams, the grandmother who had searched every day for weeks, described feeling naive and stupid for having hoped the children would be found alive. "I was so focused on the idea of rescue, of reunion, of being the person who brought those babies home to their parents," she said. "I never let myself really consider that someone had taken them specifically to kill them, that they were already dead while we were calling their names in the forest." Dr. Amanda Foster, the crisis counselor who had been working with the community throughout the ordeal, explained that this type of secondary trauma was common in cases involving serial killers. When people invest emotionally in searching for victims, when they allow themselves to hope for positive outcomes, the discovery that the victims were doomed from the beginning creates a unique form of psychological injury. The volunteers and community members who searched for Jack and Lillian are grieving not just for the children, but for their own lost innocence about the nature of evil. The Sullivan family faced the impossible task of mourning their children while also processing the knowledge that their deaths had been planned and executed by someone who had been watching them, studying their routines, waiting for the right moment to destroy their lives. The random tragedy they had initially imagined was replaced by the more disturbing reality that they had been specifically targeted by a predator who viewed their children as objects to be collected. Mrs. Sullivan, who had barely been functioning since the children's disappearance, found herself unable to leave her house after learning about Daniel Harrison. The knowledge that he had been watching their family, documenting their activities, learning their patterns made every memory feel contaminated. "I keep thinking about all the times we played in the backyard, all the times I let them ride their bikes in the driveway, all the ordinary moments when we felt safe," she told Dr. Foster. "He was probably watching us during some of those times, planning, deciding when to take them. It makes me feel like our whole life was a lie." The community's response to this revelation was complex and sometimes contradictory. Some residents became more security conscious, installing cameras, changing locks, restricting their children's activities. Others seemed to go in the opposite direction, refusing to let fear change their lives, insisting on maintaining normal routines as an act of defiance against the terror Harrison had tried to create. Local businesses reported both increased sales of security equipment and decreased attendance at community events. Parents were torn between the desire to protect their children and the recognition that complete safety was impossible, that predators like Harrison were skilled at adapting to whatever precautions families might take. The broader implications of the case extended beyond the immediate community. Law enforcement agencies across the country were reviewing unsolved missing persons cases, looking for patterns that might indicate additional victims of Daniel Harrison or other serial killers operating with similar methods. The investigation had revealed how easily such predators could move between jurisdictions, working normal jobs, appearing to be productive members of society while secretly hunting children. Child safety experts used the case to highlight the limitations of traditional stranger danger education. Harrison hadn't been a stranger lurking in bushes or offering candy from a van. He had been an ordinary-looking adult who worked regular jobs and lived in normal communities. The threat he represented couldn't be addressed through simple warnings about avoiding strangers, but required more sophisticated discussions about how predators actually operate. The media coverage evolved to include broader discussions about child protection, community safety, and the psychological profiles of serial killers who target children. Experts appeared on news programs to explain how predators like Harrison were able to operate undetected for extended periods, how they selected victims, and what warning signs communities should watch for. But perhaps the most profound impact was on the concept of childhood innocence itself. In a community where children had grown up believing that their neighborhood was safe, where parents had felt secure letting their children play outside, where families had trusted in the basic decency of their neighbors, The revelation that a serial killer had been living among them shattered fundamental assumptions about safety and community. The case became a touchstone for broader conversations about parental anxiety in modern society. Message boards and social media groups filled with discussions from parents struggling to balance the desire to give their children normal, free-range childhoods with the terrifying knowledge that predators like Daniel Harrison existed and could be anywhere. Child psychologists reported increases in anxiety-related symptoms among children in the community as young people struggled to process the knowledge that someone had been planning to hurt children like them. Many children became reluctant to play outside, afraid to be separated from their parents, hypervigilant about adults in their environment. The ripple effects extended to neighboring communities as well, as parents throughout the region questioned whether their own neighborhoods might harbor similar dangers. The manhunt for Harrison had revealed that he had been researching families in multiple locations, suggesting that many more children had been at risk than just those he had actually victimized. Schools throughout the province implemented additional security measures and updated their safety protocols. Police departments increased patrols in residential neighborhoods and around schools. Community organizations canceled or modified events that might create opportunities for predators to observe or access children. But the most lasting impact was philosophical. The recognition that evil doesn't always look like what we expect, that the most dangerous predators are often those who appear most normal, and that the safety we think we can provide for our children is always more fragile than we want to believe. The memorial service for Jack and Lily Sullivan drew thousands of attendees, including many of the volunteers who had searched for them and community members who had never met the family but felt connected to their tragedy. The service became not just a farewell to two innocent children, but a communal acknowledgement of the loss of innocence that their deaths represented for everyone who loved them. As the investigation continued and the manhunt for Daniel Harrison intensified, the community was left to grapple with questions that had no easy answers. How do you protect children from evil that hides in plain sight? How do you maintain hope and trust in a world where people like Harrison exist? How do you honor the memory of victims like Jack and Lillian while also finding the strength to continue living, to keep believing in the possibility of safety and goodness? If this story has affected you, if you're thinking about the children in your own life and how to keep them safe, then hit that like button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Because Jack and Lillian's story isn't just about two children who were taken too soon. It's about all of us, about how we protect innocence in a world where predators like Daniel Harrison can hide among us, planning evil while wearing the mask of normalcy. 2 years have passed since Jack and Lily Sullivan's bodies were discovered in that dark forest, and Daniel Harrison remains one of Canada's most wanted fugitives. The task force dedicated to his capture has evolved from an emergency response team into a long-term investigative unit, understanding that hunting a predator with Harrison's skills and preparation requires patience, persistence, and the kind of methodical police work that can take years to yield results. Detective Sarah Morrison, now the lead coordinator of the Harrison Task Force, maintains a wall in her office covered with maps, photographs, and timeline charts tracking every confirmed sighting, every potential lead, every piece of evidence that might eventually lead to his capture. "We know he's still out there," she explains to the families of his victims during quarterly briefings. "Someone with his psychological profile doesn't just stop. He's either dead, which we have no evidence to support, or he's found a way to continue his activities while staying below our radar." The investigation has expanded to include partnerships with international law enforcement agencies, as evidence suggests Harrison may have fled Canada entirely. His wilderness survival skills, combined with his demonstrated ability to assume false identities, make him capable of living off the grid for extended periods while potentially planning new crimes in locations where he's not yet known to authorities. Interpol has added Harrison to their database of wanted international criminals, distributing his photograph and profile to law enforcement agencies in dozens of countries. The FBI has included him on their 10 most wanted list, offering a substantial reward for information leading to his capture. Despite this international attention, he has managed to remain completely invisible for over 18 months. The psychological profile developed by the task force's behavioral analysts suggests that Harrison's need to kill children is compulsive rather than opportunistic, meaning he will eventually surface to commit new crimes. This makes him extremely dangerous, but also provides the best hope for his eventual capture, as active predators inevitably make mistakes that can lead to their identification and arrest. The question isn't if Daniel Harrison will strike again, explains FBI profiler Dr. Sarah Chin. The question is where and when, and whether we'll be ready to catch him when he does. Someone with his psychological pathology can't simply stop killing. The compulsion is too strong, the satisfaction too important to his mental state. He's either already claimed new victims in locations we haven't connected to him yet, or he's actively planning his next attack. The families of Harrison's known victims have formed a support network, meeting regularly to share information, provide emotional support, and advocate for continued resources for the investigation. The Sullivan family has become particularly vocal in their efforts to keep the case in the public eye, understanding that sustained attention is crucial for eventual resolution. Mrs. Sullivan, who has slowly begun to rebuild her life around the permanent absence of her children, speaks regularly at conferences and events focused on child safety and victim rights. Jack and Lillian can't be brought back, she tells audiences, her voice stronger now but still carrying the weight of indescribable loss. But every day that Daniel Harrison remains free is another day that some other family's children are at risk. We can't let the world forget about him just because time has passed. The investigation has revealed additional victims that were previously unconnected to Harrison's crimes. Database analysis and pattern recognition have identified at least 3 more cases in remote areas of the United States that bear his signature characteristics. The scope of his activities appears to be much larger than initially understood, with a victim count that may eventually reach double digits across multiple jurisdictions. Each new victim identification provides additional evidence that could prove crucial if Harrison is ever apprehended, but also adds to the weight of urgency felt by everyone involved in the manhunt. The families of these newly identified victims are experiencing their own fresh trauma as they learn that their children's deaths, which they had processed as random tragedies or unsolved mysteries, were actually the work of a serial killer who is still at large. The community where Jack and Lillian lived has established a memorial foundation in their names, dedicated to child safety education and support for families of missing and murdered children. The foundation provides funding for improved security measures at schools and community centers, sponsors educational programs about recognizing and reporting suspicious behavior, and offers counseling services for families affected by child victimization. The memorial itself stands in the park where Jack and Lillian used to play, a simple granite marker surrounded by butterfly gardens that bloom throughout the warm months. Lillian had loved butterflies, and Jack had been fascinated by the caterpillars that would eventually transform into the creatures his sister adored. The garden serves as both a remembrance of their innocent spirits and a symbol of transformation, hope emerging from tragedy. Local law enforcement has maintained increased vigilance in the community, understanding that predators sometimes return to areas where they've had success. Officers regularly patrol neighborhoods where families with young children live, and the department has established specialized training programs focused on identifying and investigating crimes against children. The school district has implemented comprehensive safety protocols developed in response to Jack and Lillian's case. These include enhanced background checking for all employees and volunteers, improved physical security measures, and educational programs that teach children about personal safety without creating excessive fear or anxiety. But the most significant change has been in the community's collective awareness of vulnerability. Parents who once felt secure in their small town's safety now understand that predators can appear anywhere, can integrate themselves into any community, can present themselves as helpful, normal individuals while harboring deadly intentions. This awareness has created a more vigilant but also more fearful community. Children who once played freely in neighborhood yards now have more restricted activities. Parents who once trusted their instincts about people they encountered now question their ability to recognize potential threats. The innocent trust that once characterized community relationships has been replaced by a more cautious, suspicious approach to interactions with strangers. Mental health professionals report that the long-term psychological impact of the case continues to affect community members years after the initial tragedy. Children who were Jack and Lillian's age when they were murdered are now dealing with adolescent anxiety about safety and security. Parents continue to struggle with balancing protection with allowing their children normal developmental experiences. The media attention surrounding the case has gradually decreased, but anniversary coverage and periodic updates about the manhunt keep Jack and Lillian's story in the public consciousness. True crime podcasts, documentary filmmakers, and investigative journalists continue to examine different aspects of the case, sometimes generating new tips or leads that investigators follow up on. Social media groups dedicated to finding Daniel Harrison remain active, with amateur investigators sharing theories, analyzing evidence, and distributing his photograph to new audiences. While most of these efforts don't produce actionable intelligence, they serve the important function of keeping his image circulating and maintaining public awareness of his fugitive status. The financial cost of the ongoing investigation is substantial, but law enforcement agencies continue to justify the expense based on the certainty that Harrison will kill again if not apprehended. The task force has been reduced in size but maintains specialized personnel dedicated exclusively to his capture, understanding that this level of focus is necessary when hunting someone with his sophistication and experience. Technology improvements have enhanced the investigation's capabilities over time. Facial recognition software, improved database analysis, and enhanced communication between jurisdictions provide tools that weren't available during the initial manhunt. These technological advances offer hope that Harrison will be identified and captured when he eventually surfaces to commit new crimes or access services that require identification. The families of his victims maintain regular contact with investigators, providing emotional pressure to continue the search while also offering support and understanding for the challenges involved in hunting someone who has had years to establish new identities and hiding places. Their continued advocacy ensures that political and administrative leaders understand the importance of maintaining resources for the investigation. International cooperation has produced several promising leads over the past 2 years, including potential sightings in remote areas of Alaska, northern Mexico, and Eastern Europe. Each lead requires extensive investigation and usually proves to be either mistaken identity or deliberate misdirection, but investigators understand that persistence in following even unlikely possibilities is essential when hunting someone of Harrison's capabilities. The case has become a teaching tool for law enforcement agencies training officers in child abduction investigation and serial killer manhunts. The lessons learned from Harrison's crimes and successful evasion of capture are being used to improve protocols and procedures for future cases, ensuring that other families don't have to endure the prolonged uncertainty that continues to plague the families of his victims. As this investigation continues, as the search for Daniel Harrison enters its 3rd year, the questions that began with Jack and Lillian Sullivan's disappearance remain unanswered. Where is he hiding? How many more children has he killed? When will justice finally catch up with a predator who has proven remarkably skilled at staying invisible while continuing to pose a threat to children everywhere? Thank you for following Jack and Lillian Sullivan's story to the end. If this case moved you, hit like and subscribe because we have more stories that deserve to be heard, more victims who deserve to be remembered, more predators who need to be found. Share your thoughts, your feelings, and your theories in the comments below. Tell me where you're watching from, because Jack and Lillian's story has reached people all over the world, and their memory deserves to live on until justice is finally served. Their killer is still out there, still dangerous, still hunting. But as long as we remember their names, as long as we keep searching for the monster who took them, Jack and Lillian Sullivan's legacy will continue to protect other children from suffering the same fate. Their story isn't over until Daniel Harrison is finally brought to justice, and we will never stop searching for the man who stole their future, but couldn't destroy the love that keeps their memory alive. Subscribe now, share this video, and help us make sure that Jack and Lillian Sullivan are never forgotten, and that Daniel Harrison has nowhere left to hide.